Welcome to all those joining us today. My name is Shelley Hartland, and I'm the Director of Operations and Cultural Transformation for the Legatum Institute. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this webinar to showcase our United States Prosperity Index and preview our county-level analysis for Colorado. At the Legatum Institute, we are committed to creating pathways from poverty to prosperity for individuals, communities, and nations. To achieve this, we produce a number of indexes and data sets to help leaders around the world develop practical solutions to deliver genuine and lasting economic and social well-being. Our United States Prosperity Index is just one of those indexes. Thanks to the generosity of the Helmsley Charitable Trust, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation, we have drawn on our 13 years of experience measuring prosperity globally to create a holistic and comprehensive analysis of how prosperity is evolving across the 50 states of the Union and Washington, D.C. As part of this program, we've undertaken a detailed county-level analysis for several key states, including Colorado. This work will be published next month, but we are delighted to preview some of our findings with you today. We hope this work will provide an objective means of considering how Colorado might emerge more prosperous from its current health, social, and economic challenges. In addition to our own speakers, we are delighted to be joined by two expert panelists today. Carol Hedges is Executive Director of the Colorado Fiscal Institute, and Tiffani Lennon is Executive Director of the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. Thank you both for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your reflections on the index, as well as the challenges and opportunities for Colorado as you see them. There will also be an opportunity for our panel to take questions, so please use the Q&A function to ask these, ideally including your name, organization, and who your question is directed to. If you have any general comments, please do use the chat function to exchange thoughts and ideas. We do ask that you choose the option of posting comments to both panelists and attendees, as this is a great way to start a conversation with those who are also in attendance. And finally, you can find our index data along with our current report and state profiles at our website, www.usprosperity.net. I'm now delighted to welcome our Director of Policy, Dr. Stephen Brien, to provide an introduction to the United States Prosperity Index.
Thank you, Shelley, and good morning to everybody. It's my real privilege and pleasure to be here today, and a great opportunity for us to share with you our work on the United States Prosperity Index, which we've been undertaking for the last year or two on the back of the work that Shelley mentioned that we have been conducting for the last 13 years around the world. But let's start a little bit by really unpacking what we mean by prosperity. When we think about prosperity, what we are seeking to define, measure, and ultimately help generate is a blend of economic and social well-being, a combination of material wealth generation and that sense of good quality lived experience that really provides people with a fulfilled life. And really, we've seen in the last few months the reasons why this is so much more important than simply looking at GDP. You know, whether it be the impact of the COVID pandemic on people's thinking about quality of health, but also the quality of the governance around how those systems operate and people's freedoms to move and how that gets moderated. And more recently, with some of the social unrest, that sense of making sure that everybody has an opportunity to fulfill their potential. So what we have been doing is looking beyond the economic figures, looking beyond the very narrow figures, say, of life expectancy or health outcomes, and seeking to create a sort of rich, well-organized view of what it takes to have a prosperous society. And at the top level, we look at it in three domains. We say a prosperous society is an inclusive society where the institutions work well. There are open economies that help generate that material well-being, the wealth that's needed, the resources that are needed. And then also having empowered people whose health, whose education, whose living conditions are good and who are living in a natural environment that is sustainable. So when we add that together, we can think about a rich definition, which we have then organized around 12 pillars. What we have here on this next slide is a schematic that lays out the actual definition of prosperity as we have used it in this index. So you see the three domains there: inclusive societies, open economies, empowered people. Within those domains, we have the pillars, and then within each pillar, a set of very tangible policy-focused elements. So first up, inclusive societies. As I said, that takes a look at the institutional structures, which means all the different ways, both formal and informal, in which people engage and interact with each other. So we think about safety and security. Is the state peaceful, or is there a high crime level? We think about terrorism, violent crime, property crime. There are obviously things you don't want. These are one way in which people interact with each other. Another way is to the extent to which there's true personal freedom. Are there civil rights? Is there social tolerance? To what degree of agency do people have? How much discrimination is there? And that captures the essence of whether people are able to fulfill their lives, their potential, unencumbered by rules that restrict them or social mores that restrict them. Then governance is around the power arrangements in society. So we think about political accountability, the rule of law, the extent to which there's corruption in government, or transparency in government. So here we're asking ourselves, are those state institutions of power well organized, accountable to people, or not? And then finally, within inclusive society, social capital, which is essentially the glue between people. So are there strong family and social relationships? Are there networks in society, social networks of trust at a community level, trust between strangers? Is there institutional trust? Do people have confidence in the government, in the media, in the courts, the police? All these important organs of state, are they acting in a trustworthy way? And then finally, is there civic and social participation? Do people engage in their communities in a positive and constructive way? Or do they sit back and are they passive? The next domain, open economies, looks at the economic engine. So whether there's a good business environment that allows people to grow and expand businesses, can they be formed easily? What are the rules and regulations around that? Access to capital, the labor market. Is there occupational licensing that's preventing things? Then we think about the infrastructure and market access. So this is about the sort of core elements that are needed to be able to run and operate a business. You know, whether it be access to water for agriculture or any form of production, access to sustained electricity, or high quality communications. And if you think about even in Colorado, having good quality broadband available all the time everywhere is an important issue, particularly in sort of COVID times. Then economic quality, which looks at the level of labor force engagement, the dynamism, the number of new companies that are being formed, how productive and competitive is the economy, what level of fiscal sustainability is there? Do you have a sound fiscal setup, or is there going to be a sort of debt crisis or unfunded pension liabilities that could come back and cause problems? And then the final domain is empowered people, where we look really at the lived experience. So we look at living conditions. Do people have the material resources, or are they impoverished? Do they have access to the core elements that are needed for a good life in terms of housing, access to sort of basic water, sanitation? In health, we think through all the different elements, from behavioral risk factors, public health issues, quality of the care system, ultimately to the physical health and the longevity of people. And in education, likewise, we assess the quality of the system from pre-K through K-12, then into tertiary education, which will cover universities and vocational education. And the natural environment, we look at the different domains, whether we talk about the level of emissions or the quality of the air, quality of the land, quality of fresh water, etc. So this gives us a very broad, but yet well-defined definition of prosperity. And we measure all these elements using multiple indicators. And having it all in one place, in a consistent framework, then allows us not only to, as it were, rank different states, but also ask questions of what's the relationship between quality and strength of social capital and labor force engagement, or the relationship between education and public health, or living conditions and governance. So we can really start to tease out what are the underlying drivers of prosperity and how do they relate to each other. So we've been doing this, and we, a while ago, had a look at the US and said, from a global perspective, the US economy is very strong. It's got a vibrant economic powerhouse. It drives a lot of the world's economy. And hence, when we look at it in our rankings, we see it fourth on the open economies. But when we broaden out our perspective into the full gamut of prosperity, as we do every year in our global index, we see a slightly less rosy picture. And that is that the US has historically come in at around 17th, 18th in the rankings. That's a long way back down from the fourth on the economic domain. And what we see is that areas such as safety and security, because of, say, violent crime, drags the US down. Interesting as well, health. Because of it, so health in the US is uneven. The quality of healthcare, the access is quite uneven. The United States has some of the world's leading hospital networks, very innovative and groundbreaking pharmaceutical companies, and it spends a huge amount of its resources on health in terms of percent of GDP. But when you look at the sort of standard measurements and metrics around the world, what we see is that does not translate into high quality universal healthcare and health outcomes. Again, living conditions also are not as universal as you might hope for. So it's this unevenness that, in our view, has dragged the US down from what you might think just purely looking at its economic strength. And that's what we wanted to get a better handle on. And hence, we said, let's get a view of all the 50 states plus DC and say, can we see a geographic pattern? What is the prosperity of each state like? And what can we learn from looking at it on a state-by-state basis? So when we looked around, what we could see, as we looked at other indexes, we could see the freedom of the 50 states gave some element of it. We could see that the county health rankings would give us some element of it. But there was nothing that we could see out there that had a sense of prosperity across the 50 states. And that's why we set out about 18 months ago to build a prosperity index for the United States, very much on the template of our global index, looking at the three domains of inclusive societies, open economies, and empowered people, and asking on a state-by-state and now on a county-by-county basis, what's the picture we see? What are the trends we're seeing? Where do we see areas of strength? Where do we see areas that need strengthening? Now, Shaun, in a minute, will talk you through some more detailed findings for Colorado. But let me first share with you a short video that provides the sort of key highlights from our first United States Prosperity Index.
The Legatum Prosperity Index shows that prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, overall prosperity in the US had been rising for the past decade, although long-standing challenges mean that prosperity was not experienced equally by all Americans. Although the country was ranked high for economic pillars, it was falling behind in living conditions, health, and safety and security. Our U.S. Prosperity Index shows that the country's economic quality had improved as unemployment had fallen after the financial crisis. This meant it was in a strong position before the virus hit, but of course that strength is now at risk. Improvements in education and living conditions had also been significant in driving the growth and prosperity over the past 10 years. Although education had been improving, school closures as a result of lockdown measures put the progress made on educational outcomes at risk. More positively, one area of living conditions that had improved significantly over the last decade was connectedness, with access to broadband rising in both rural and urban areas, enabling greater connectivity during lockdown. Health in America had improved over the first 8 years of the past decade, so the country was in a good position to deal with the impact of the pandemic. However, the mental health of Americans had already been declining even before the coronavirus crisis. There had been large increases in drug overdose deaths, rates of suicide, and levels of serious mental illness across all regions, with 48 states seeing mental health decline over the past decade. Deteriorating social capital was also impeding further prosperity. While personal and family relationships had strengthened, social networks, institutional trust, and civic and social participation had all deteriorated. The fact that only 11 states had seen an improvement in social capital since 2009 is a real concern, given strong communities are the cornerstones of society, and the decline in other states is indicative of societies that were already coming apart rather than drawing together. Despite these national challenges, the US Prosperity Index shows that before 2020, prosperity had improved in 47 of the 50 states, plus Washington, D.C., providing a strong foundation on which to build a recovery as the country emerges from these challenging times. But while all but 4 states had seen prosperity improve, no single state has yet succeeded in fostering a high degree of both economic and social well-being for its entire population. Other than top-ranked Massachusetts, no state ranked above 20th in all 11 pillars of prosperity. Now more than ever, it is vital that all states seize the opportunities to learn from each other, to increase their prosperity, and share their experiences with one another to help them improve.
I now invite Shaun Flanagan, the director of our Centre for Metrics, to unpack the index in more detail.
Thank you very much, Shelley, and good afternoon and good morning to everyone. As Shelley says, my name's Shaun Flanagan. I'm the director of the Centre for Metrics at the Legatum Institute, and it is my privilege and pleasure to lead a team that produces our indexes. Before I sort of get going on some of the findings for Colorado in particular, I just wanted to pause for a moment and build upon what Stephen was talking about. So Stephen mentions we've constructed a holistic and composite measure of prosperity across the 50 states of the Union and DC. And whilst we at the Institute are experts in measurement and measuring prosperity in particular, we recognise that we wanted to draw upon local expertise in constructing the US index. And so we were advised and steered by about 40 experts on health, education across the 11 pillars. And I just wanted to say thank you very much to those experts. Their input and guidance and advice was invaluable to us as we built this index, and we're indebted for their help. So just want to recognise that and thank them. So just how does prosperity map across the 50 states of the Union and DC? On the left, you have a map of the US, and what you'll see probably immediately is there is a bit of a north-south divide in how prosperity translates across the US. So 8 of the 10 weakest performing states are located in the south. And whilst the majority of top performing states are in the northeast, it's not universally the case that all the strongest performing states are there. So we actually have Colorado in the top 10, but also Utah, Minnesota, and Washington State also perform well. But what does the index tell us about Colorado? So overall, the state ranks 8th out of 51 on prosperity. But as you glance across the table, you'll see that it has a sort of mixed performance across the different pillars. So its best performing ranking is on governance, where it ranks 4th. Its weakest performing performance is on market access and infrastructure, where it ranks 44th. But apart from that weak performance, it performs pretty well across most of the other pillars, apart from safety and security, where it's 30th. On the empowered people domain, most of the rankings there are inside or just outside the top 10. How has that prosperity changed over the past decade? So on the top left, what you see here is the performance of Colorado over the past 10 years, and then compared to the US average as a whole. Obviously, Colorado outperforms the US average as a whole on prosperity and has seen an improvement over the past decade. On the right-hand side, what you see there is what has driven that improvement. So again, a bit of a mixed performance. So on the open economies domain, we see that actually economic quality, like many states, has seen an improvement over the past decade as unemployment levels have fallen, as states have become more able to generate wealth sustainably, but business environment has deteriorated. We see on the inclusive societies domain that safety and security, personal freedom and governance have also declined. But interestingly, social capital, Colorado is one of the 11 states to have seen an improvement in social capital over that past decade, and there could be some learnings here for other states. But we see the strongest performance across the empowered people domain, where living conditions, education, and natural environment have all seen a significant improvement. So what I want to talk you through now is one area of strength that we see in Colorado, and then to identify another state that underperforms in that area, and what is the opportunity for sharing and collaboration to learn from each other, and then to walk through an area of weakness that Colorado has seen through the index, and then to see where it might look to another state to develop and learn. So if we look at governance, which is one of the pillars, you may remember that this is an area that Colorado does particularly well on. It ranks 4th overall on governance, and it's made up of three of these policy-focused elements we use to determine governance. So political accountability, rule of law, and government integrity. And we see that Colorado ranks 2nd on political accountability overall. But what are the indicators that underpin that particular element? So it's made up of 4 measures. The Elections Performance Index. This is a composite measure of election administration policy and performance, and it's based on returned and rejected ballots, post-election audits, ballot turnouts, voter registration rate, waiting time, online election tool accessibility. So we see here that it has a score of 0.8, so it ranks 22nd. On the other indicators, we see gender balance in the legislature. So this is the percentage of legislators in each state who are women. So we have a 38% in Colorado, which is a high percentage compared to other states. State campaign disclosure, this is around, sort of transparency around independent spending disclosure, disclosure of contributor information, timeliness of putting that information out, and the ability to which public can access that information. And again, Colorado score 0.9 here ranks 8th. And then finally on term limits, this is obviously the extent to which term limits apply to the legislature, and Colorado has them, and therefore it gets a score of 1 on this. So overall, we see that all of those things combined give Colorado a particularly high score and strong performance. But let's look at another state where we see that that's not such a strong performance. And if we look at Utah, it ranks 41st in this particular element compared to Colorado. When we compare and contrast the particular indicators, we see that there's over a 10 percentage point difference in gender balance in legislatures, and then across state campaign disclosure, election performance index, and Utah doesn't have term limits in the legislature. So here is a potential for Utah to learn from Colorado. How could it take some of the measures that Colorado has in strengthening and having a strong political accountability that it could look to adopt to help to improve its score in this particular area? So if we take an area of weakness as identified by the index, you may remember again that on market access and infrastructure, Colorado ranks 44th. That's made up of these 4 elements: communications, resources, transport, and market distortions. And what we see on communications is that Colorado ranks 46th, and in fact, it's seen a deterioration over the past decade, and therefore has also fallen 4 places in the rankings. So if we look at the indicators that make up communications, it's mainly around, it's digital communication, so it's mainly around the internet, accessibility, speed, but then also covers network coverage. So we see on a number of these indicators, it ranks in the bottom half of the table on all apart from 1. So if we look at another state that actually is performing more strongly here, if we compare and contrast with Washington State, we see that Colorado ranks 46th, Washington State is 1st. And then again, when we compare and contrast the indicators, we see that there's a 10 percentage point difference in high-speed internet access between the 2 states. Similarly, ultra-fast internet availability, much higher in Washington. The mean download speed, again, is higher in Washington, and also the network coverage, higher percentage within Washington State. So Colorado could look to see what Washington State's done in terms of investment in infrastructure, what initiatives, what projects, what strategies has it put in place to improve the access to digital communications, which obviously benefits individuals, as we were saying earlier, during this time of COVID-19, but also is hugely important to businesses to have that strength and availability of fast and powerful internet. So there's just a couple of examples on the state level index, on looking at strengths and weaknesses and where could another learn from another state. I just wanted to conclude, as Shelley was saying earlier, on our county level analysis. So this year, past year, we've stood up a county level index, and next month we will be publishing the findings of this, but I just wanted to do a slight show and tell today of some of those findings. So what we've done with our county level index, we would have liked to have done this for all 3,000 plus counties in the US, but due to resources, time, etc., we haven't been able to do that. So we selected 8 states from the index, and these have been selected on a sort of geographical and demographic basis, and also where they sit within the state level index. So we wanted to get a good spread of sort of more prosperous states and less prosperous states. So we've worked on New York, Georgia, Iowa, Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, Montana, and California. And this map here shows you overall prosperity as it translates across the counties within these states, 829 counties in all, and they've been grouped into quintiles. And what you'll see immediately is there are some states such as Iowa, but also Colorado, that are fairly homogenous in how prosperity translates across the counties. We don't see that in all states. When we look at likes of California and Texas, for example, we see a greater disparity of prosperity across the counties. We also see, not universally the case, but urban areas are often more prosperous than rural areas. So when we look at California, you'll see that around the Bay Area, but also Los Angeles area. But that isn't universally the case. So what does this tell us about how prosperity translates across the counties of Colorado? So here we have the map of Colorado. On the left, we have the strongest performing states, and then on the right, the weakest performing states of the 64. And you'll see immediately again that the vast majority of counties rank within the top 2 quintiles. There are a couple in the middle quintile, but the majority are in the top 2 quintiles. And then when we look at how that translates across the 3 domains, we see a different picture. So on inclusive societies, it's fairly homogeneous. In the top left, we see that most counties are in the top quintile with a few in the second quintile. That's similar, but perhaps a little bit more dispersed when we look at empowered people in the top right. But where we see the biggest difference is in the open economies domain. We see a number of counties in the top quintile, but we also see a number of counties in the bottom quintiles showing a greater disparity, a dispersion on the open economies domain. This can obviously be interrogated further through the data. You can go down into pillars and you can go down into the indicators to really delve a bit deeper. Unfortunately, not time to do that today. I just wanted to conclude by showing you some of the other analysis that we've done. So one way of analysing the counties is very much to look within each state, so to analyse the counties within each state and how they compare and contrast. But what we also did through our analysis, which is, as I say, more detail in the report, is looking at how these counties cluster together across states. So where do they share similar characteristics of prosperity? So we had 2 sort of broad groupings, if you like. We looked at sort of the archetypes of urban prosperity and the archetypes of rural prosperity. On the left is the chart showing the archetypes of urban prosperity. So these are grouped into 3 clusters, as it were: metropolitan core, large southern cities, and small southern cities. And then on the right-hand side, the archetypes of rural prosperity are the Northern Prairie, Southern Plains, and the Southeastern Coastal Plains. And what's interesting when we look at Colorado is that the counties cluster across both. So 3 counties, Adams, Arapahoe, and Denver, cluster together in the metropolitan core alongside counties from other states. And we see that that particular grouping, in terms of overall prosperity, has a higher level of prosperity than the 8-state average for those 829 counties as a whole, and sort of outperforms the other 2 archetypes of urban prosperity. And then the counties on the right, they form part of the Northern Prairie, particularly alongside other counties in Montana. And there again, is the sort of top performing rural archetype of rural prosperity, broadly matching the overall 8-state average. When we look at how they compare and contrast to the 8-state average across the 11 pillars. On the left, we see that Metropolitan Core. Metropolitan Core performs more strongly in personal freedom and governance. It's a weaker performance on business environments and a stronger performance on health and the natural environment. We see a bigger contrast when we look at the Northern Prairie cluster. We see there that on the inclusive society pillars, it performs much more strongly, but has a much weaker performance across the 3 pillars of the open economies domain, and a sort of mixed comparison when we look at empowered people. So you might be saying, so what? Well, one of the things that this helps us identify is what are the sort of strengths and weaknesses, what are the sort of strengths that these areas exhibit, and what are the weaknesses, so areas for improvement. So these final 2 tables, really, the one on the left shows you the areas of strength and the areas for improvement in the Metropolitan Core cluster, and on the right hand side the sort of strengths and weaknesses and areas for improvement of the Northern Prairie cluster. So areas of strength for Metropolitan Core are that this has strong economic infrastructure, high levels of social tolerance, they're well governed, and the population is healthy. But areas for improvement are around business regulations, K-12 education, crime, housing.
Okay, I found this on the web for KTK 12 education. Check it out.
And then on the Northern Prairie, we see that areas of strength and strong social capital, low levels of crime, good physical health of the population, and clean air. Those 2 are obviously related. But areas for improvement are around the financing ecosystems, communications and transport infrastructure, mental health, and access to freshwater resources. So what I've hopefully just shown you a little bit today is just wanted to showcase the indexes both from a state level and a county level. But then obviously with 10 years worth of data, 51 states, but also 829 counties and 215 indicators, there is a huge amount more that's possible in terms of analysis in interrogating this data further. So our hope, our ambition, if you like, is that state and county leaders and other policymakers will use these indexes to help develop and deliver data-driven policies that will deliver even greater prosperity for all Americans. As I mentioned earlier, all of this information is available on our website. It's all open source. It's freely available at www.usprosperity.net. I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening, and I will now hand you back to Shelley. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Shaun. Just to point out as well, someone, Brandy in the chat, was asking about whether we're recording today's session. Yes, we will be recording, and we'll make sure that you all get a copy of the recording once it's edited and online. So we will be in touch with that. I know we've already had a few questions through on the Q&A, but I'd just encourage you, please keep sending those questions through. If anything that you've already heard you'd like to send a question on, or we've got our 2 sort of panelists coming up, if there's anything you'd like to hear more on, please do send those questions through, as we'd love to just have something to get us started in that discussion. So as we've heard from Shaun, there are clearly a number of challenges ahead, especially due to the health and economic consequences of the COVID pandemic. However, there are also huge opportunities for Colorado to emerge more prosperous from this. And to discuss some of these opportunities and challenges, I'll now turn to our expert panelists to offer their thoughts. Tiffani, if I can come to you first. As Executive Director of the Colorado Center on Law and Policy, you are actively working for a Colorado where everyone has what they need to succeed. What do you think poverty looks like in Colorado, and what is missing in capturing the complete picture of how prosperity is evolving across the state?
Thank you very much, and thank you to the presenters. This is a good opportunity for us to highlight where Colorado is at, where we can go, and the opportunities that are before us, certainly. In particular, it is my pleasure to highlight some of the disparities that do exist in Colorado. So thank you so much, Shelley, for your question. Colorado Center on Law and Policy researches this question quite a lot. We work to advance solutions to poverty across the state for all Coloradans. We have a particular lens on racial equity, and when we look at the racial and ethnic breakdown across the state, what we see is a tremendous amount of disparity. While Colorado on a whole is doing pretty well, when we break it down by race, the disparity really becomes quite apparent. So, for example, we have a middle class, we define middle class. Typically, our universal understanding of middle class in the US is defined by the Pew Institute, right? Which is the median household income. Yet we also know that there's this tremendous income disparity, right? That's occurring. So it's a bit of a misnomer, in my view, to use the median income as a benchmark, because I think how people are doing overall is probably not as rosy, right, because of the income disparities that exist. But with that said, then we compound it with systemic racism and systemic issues like that, and then we really see some great disparities. For example, when we look at poverty, one of the things that would be really helpful is to understand the liquidity, right? The assets that are available. And 40% of communities of color in Colorado don't have any liquid assets to speak of. And we know that, for example, would certainly perpetuate generational poverty and poverty in general, right? So the liquidity is one factor I think that's really important to look at. So Shelley, to answer your question, if I saw if every Coloradan had what they needed, we would see far greater liquidity.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tiffani. And I've already seen some really interesting questions come through in the Q&A, so I think we can go into that in a bit more detail then, which would be great. Carol, if I can come to you now. You're the executive director of the Colorado Fiscal Institute, an organization you co-founded in order to make Colorado a place where tax and budget policies support equity and widespread economic prosperity. How do the index's findings resonate with your own experience of economic and social well-being in Colorado? And what do you think needs to change to increase prosperity?
Thank you, Shelley, and thank you so much for the invitation to be a part of this sharing of the index. The Colorado Fiscal Institute has also been pursuing ways of thinking about prosperity and economic performance that would expand on sort of our traditional views of sort of GDP, et cetera. So we're really excited to be a part of this effort. I guess what I am struck by most, I think, by the findings of the index, along with my own personal experience, is sort of the push and pull that comes between the domains. I found that it's very interesting that so much of the criteria that go into lack of market access, et cetera, I think are linked directly to the underfunding of our public sector. So we've reached a point, and I just am going to lift up broadband as an example, because that seems so relevant, particularly as we've been discussing in this time when we're really communicating most frequently through the internet. We've seen the limitations of the market's ability to distribute equitably access to internet, broadband, and high-speed internet. And at the point in which the market doesn't have an economic incentive to extend those benefits to folks who live in the sort of remote parts of the state. And our remoteness is one of the things that's wonderful about us. It's it's such a beautiful, mountainous, gorgeous place to be, but that remoteness makes it tricky and increases the costs, which decreases the incentive for the private sector to fill in these things that we all can identify as important components of prosperity. In other states that struggle with similar kinds of geographic isolation, they often have a better funded public structures that can help offset that isolation. And I go back to, one of a really founding component of the US is when we electrified the country, right? We saw a similar situation when electricity was spreading across the country. And if you look at maps of what the country looked like when the market had fulfilled its what it felt like its obligations to giving to electrifying the country, you saw dark sections of much of the country, particularly in the Midwest and the Mountain West. And that's when the public sector stepped in to create, we created cooperatives that extended electricity to farms and ranches and more remote areas. And what I'm struck by in this particular index is the need for a more robust public structures that can make up for and complement the limitations of the market economy. And in Colorado, because of some unique constitutional constraints, it's very hard for us to have the kinds of to raise adequate revenue for public investments. And I guess that's one of the things that seems consistent with my sort of interaction with our with prosperity in Colorado, but also pointed to me in the direction of it might be something where we can learn from others.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carol. That's really insightful. And it's so good to have another sort of local opinion as well. So thank you both for those really insightful remarks, which are just the start of hopefully your insightful remarks. So let's address now some of the questions that you've sent in the speakers and our panelists as well. So one that it would be great, Stephen, if I could direct this to you, but also Tiffani, if I could get your thoughts on this too. Someone has asked, the recent social unrest following the tragic death of George Floyd has reminded us that opportunity is not felt equally by all groups in our society. What does the index tell us about how economic and social well-being are experienced by the various demographic groups? And what more do we need to do to address the social challenges we have seen in recent weeks? So Stephen, if I could just come to you first with that.
So as I mentioned in my remarks, the unevenness of prosperity and the drivers of prosperity within the US was one of the triggers for this work in the first place. And what we have been able to do with the data that's publicly available sort of systematically across the country is break that down geographically down to county level. And that gives us some hints as regards other demographic drivers, because there will be some counties that are much more diverse than others. If I think about Colorado, there are certain counties that have a high Hispanic population. And if we start to see different outcomes, different pictures there, you can start to at least infer a demographic pattern behind it. However, what we really want to do is to be able to not just look geographically, but in effect, disaggregate these drivers of prosperity by demographics. However, one of the challenges that we have found is we have been seeking to build out a systematic index across the 50 states, is that getting access to this information in a consistent way across all the states is one of the challenges. So, Tiffani mentioned, we can go to an individual state and get data from that state, another state maybe, etc. But to do the exercise that we are seeking to do, we need to try and find data that's available consistently across everywhere, so that if we have a particular breakdown in one state, we have it in other states. So, I have called out, and I'll sort of continue at every opportunity to call out to the Census Bureau, BLS, and others to do a lot more to share demographically segmented data, not only at a federal level, but at a disaggregated geographic level where the scale allows. Obviously, when you're down in a county looking at a very minority segment, there simply won't be enough data points for it to be robust. But I believe a lot more can be done. And I would say that if we can get our hands on that data, we will do our utmost to analyze it and to publish it in parallel with our index. Because I think it's, if we really are believing that we want to ensure that there's a fulfilled opportunity for everybody, we have to be true to that.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Tiffani, do you have anything to add in terms of your thoughts on that topic?
I will just echo what Dr. Brien said, because, certainly if you look at the demographic breakdown across even agencies, the criteria for how they capture that data, it differs slightly, even on a national scale. So then when you break that down further from a state by state analysis, you see that as well. And then there's, different, we rely upon the data as, self-identification in the US primarily, right? And so there are generational differences to the Latinx population, for example, how they may or may not identify. And so Dr. Brien raises a really important point. Locally, we can do something about it. Locally, we have broken it down demographically, but from a high-level view, it is much more difficult. So, I'm not surprised that the index doesn't capture it, because from that high vantage point, it would be very difficult to do so. It's difficult even when you're on the ground, but obviously, because we're on the ground, we can do it. We can capture it.
Great. Thanks for your thoughts on that, Tiffani. Shaun, if I could come to you with a question that we've been asked by Mark McCahill. Mark has asked, how does educational opportunity, aspiration, and access inform the economic prosperity of Colorado, particularly based upon employer-driven demand for multi-level qualifications and skills?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think education is obviously one of the pillars within the index, one of the 11 pillars. And what we're trying to capture there is through the different stages of education that someone will go through in their state or in their county. So all the way from pre-K through K-12 education, but then through tertiary. And there we're capturing a number of different things. We're looking at the extent of enrollment. So you see high levels of enrollment, which is obviously really important to make sure that you have that. But also, what is the quality of the education that's being received? So for the US index, we look at grade 4 and grade 8 scores, and then compare and contrast those across the state to see, is that improving, getting stronger? But then the final element that we have within the education pillar is exactly the skills aspect. So what percentage of the adult population has a degree or a high school diploma? Because that is obviously very important in looking to sort of resource business requirements within the state. So we think it's a pretty comprehensive measure, and we're trying to capture both the quality of the education, but also the skills availability to service the business industry.
Great. Carol, if I could come to you on that same question. I know you've got experience with employment and training programs and in different sort of education sectors. Do you have any additional thoughts to that question that was asked?
Yeah, I would love to jump in on that. In Colorado, we've often described something we call the Colorado paradox. And that is a situation where we have a very high level of citizenry that has a bachelor's degree or above, but our performance and our graduation rates from high schools tend not to be nearly as high. And what we've done typically, the strategy, the prosperity or economic strategy that the state has traditionally pursued, is to attract people to our physical environment, the beautiful physical environment, and get people to come here as a way of importing the skills that are foundational to economic prosperity. I think we certainly pre-COVID, there was an increased frustration on that being an appropriate strategy. To some extent, based upon the comments that Tiffani has made about, let's look at how that concentration of skills and education sorts out across different demographic groups, but also just to connect it back to another piece of the whole prosperity focus is our natural environment. And can we continue to depend upon growth from other states or import of educated folks into the state? Is that a strategy that we can or should pursue? Which of course links me back to my first comment, and that is, do we have adequate public investments and adequate resources publicly to make sure that the folks who are here in Colorado are getting the education and the skills they need to contribute at the highest levels, both for their own personal prosperity, but also for the economic prosperity of the state. So this Colorado paradox becomes a really important component as we think about prosperity for Coloradans.
Brilliant. Thanks, Carol. Dr. Brien, if I could just come to you, any additional thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think Carol sort of has put her finger on the button in terms of the sort of human capital challenge, because I would say, though, that Colorado is far from being the most extreme version of this. So there's probably also an ability to learn lessons from places like DC and indeed coastal California, where you see this phenomenon to an even greater extent. I mean, you're looking at DC, it's a real tragedy as you track, from the youngest age group through the grades, that actually performance on a sort of national level gets worse and worse and worse. And then when you get to university level, tertiary level, it pops back up again on the high level of adult skills. And you see in stark relief there the failure of the system, and then the compensation, because you've got the government sector and the sort of military industrial defense complex, all the consulting firms. You've got a fantastic one level talent attraction pool that gets people from all over the country, but the homegrown talent is not being homegrown, is not being grown. And it's a real tragedy. I use DC because it's such a stark example. I think what we see within Colorado, Denver is a mild version of that. I think less so the rest of Colorado. I think most of the pattern within Colorado that you want to worry about is the consequence of the sort of the Denver attraction, and then indeed it's also a great strength of Denver that it has managed to attract people from around the country. But I do think you're right to say, in prosperity terms, that is not a sustainable model, because you're hiding the problem behind what's happening to the kids who are growing up in the state, because they're not benefiting from that environment. I think then, to your point on the natural environment, if I may just sort of jump to another question that's come through, is I would say the index itself is not going to give you policy prescriptions for this. But what we absolutely are doing is, again, exposing the range of issues, and having worked hard with their advisors to say, okay, what are the different areas you need to look at, and say, look, there's a macro emissions problem. We need to think about that in terms of our sort of share of emissions as a function of both the population size, as it were, and the size of the economy. And then somewhere like Colorado would do well is sort of quality of the air, because the great open plains, you've got such a natural advantage there. So atmospheric pollution is low. But then looking at the quality of the soil and fresh water, it's not an unalloyed success. And what you're starting to see there is a consequence of probably centuries of aggressive farming, which again has provided an economic benefit, but is not being managed for the long term. And that's where we would certainly be sort of shining a bit of a spotlight and saying, we're not suggesting directly what the policy solutions are, but that's where the attention needs to be placed. And those closer to the ground, Carl, whether it's you or Tiffani or others, are a better place to work out what needs to be done. But the index absolutely says that's the area to worry about.
Great. Thanks for that, Stephen. Can I just ask, Carol, Tiffani, did either of you want to jump in on the natural environment climate question that was asked?
I would love to. I'll let the smart remarks come from my colleague Tiffani if she has anything to add to this. But one of the things that, our natural environment, I think, is a characteristic that has much more value than we're able to pick up in any kind of numerical index. Our weather is terrific. We have access to the out of doors to do things in the summer, in the winter. Increasingly, people, as we are less tethered to the need to be next to a body of water to ship what it is that we produce, Colorado is becoming increasingly a more attractive place, and we've seen dramatic migration in the state over time. I think that has some real consequences for prosperity for not only the people who are here, but for the folks who move in as well. And the one thing that I wanted to add about the index itself is as I know Tiffany's done this work at CCLP, and we focus on it here too, there's a real difference between urban. So when we break it urban, rural, that's one way of looking at it. In Colorado, we have urban or concentrated urban and rural resort. And rural resort is a completely different sense. These are small towns, but they are economic hubs that have all to do with the natural environment, but not necessarily the natural economic environment in terms of traditional production of goods and services. And so that is another one of those things that I think distorts Colorado results a little bit when we look at how similar counties are. That pull of the fact that we have ski resorts and we have big lakes that attract people in the summertime. I mean, I think that the analysis is correct, right? I'm not disagreeing that the indicators have been analyzed correctly, but I think it does have a different play in terms of regular kind of economic prosperity outcomes. Simply the difference between the Eastern Plains, where it is agricultural-based rural, and the northern and central parts of the state that are rural resort areas, which have a completely different makeup of their local economies.
Can I come back to you, Stephen, on that?
Sure, because Carol, you have just unpacked and released to the world one of the sort of secret essays that we haven't yet published on this, where we did a lot of statistical analysis, sort of clustering counties around the country. So it took all 800 counties, and the resort counties in Colorado came out as a relatively unique group, with some others in Montana as well. So there's very definitely this sort of quasi-rural but very prosperous pockets that came out, without sort of the computer knowing where they were. It said they're different, statistically different. So you're absolutely, we spotted that.
And Shelley, if I can just jump back in for a minute, and I think it creates particular challenges because much of that resort economy is very service-based, which then gets back to this link of the have and have-nots within those communities. And so it distorts or uncovers up a little bit of the kind of differentiation, if we could unpack more by racial demographics and educational demographics, where Pitkin County, Summit County, Plata County, all of those have really deep stories within those communities that we're looking forward to hearing more about the county analysis. And I know it's a lot of what shapes the work that Tiffani and I's organizations focus on.
Great. Tiffani, did you want to jump in on that one?
I wanted to highlight something that Dr. Brien said. And yes, if you're in Colorado, you know that when we talk about the rural communities, we sort of think, oh, and then there's Vail and Aspen and Telluride, right?
Yeah.
Like that, I think it's become part of our makeup to think differently about when we talk about rural communities, to be cautious in how we talk about them because of the resorts. But I want to switch gears a little bit and go back to something that Dr. Brien talked about, which is the environment, right? And our excessive, perhaps, farming and agricultural use of the soil. And I heard your warning in that, and I was struck by that in the index. I will say I was surprised in the index that Colorado came back as high on the air quality because, and I'm certainly not an expert on the atmosphere or anything like that, but I was struck by the air quality because at times we have very, very poor air quality because of our geography, right? And the fact that we live in a bit of a bowl. And so air quality sometimes has been likened to Beijing, which is terrifying. But nonetheless, your point about the environment, I think, is really important. I think organizations like mine and like Carol's, we need to do a better job, particularly my organization, right? Because we look at health, food, income, and housing. And, it's only been in the last decade or so that we have fully understood, how social indicators will influence health. And I think we have to do a better job of recognizing how our environment is truly impacting our public health, and therefore making that connection to poverty, right? Or lack of prosperity, because I don't think my organization is doing a good enough job yet about making that linkage back to public health, right? Because we know that income has everything to do with a health indicator, and vice versa. And so the environment is linked to that as well. And so I just wanted you to know that I heeded your warning there, and it's something we have to be thoughtful about, certainly.
Right.
I feel like we could continue this discussion for a very long time, and I'm aware we're sort of coming to the end of our hour. I might just finish off with one final question. I think I've got to almost all the ones in the Q&A. Shaun, if I could direct this one at you. We've just had a question from Sally Hartford saying, how much of the action needed to improve prosperity in the US requires national action, and how much needs to be driven at a state level?
I think some of the findings that you saw through the video sort of alluded to some of the national challenges that I think the US faces. So particularly around declining mental health, and particularly as we're battling the states in particular at the moment with COVID-19. The sort of concerns that raises not just around sort of job loss, future employment security, but also just general anxiety. Mental health is obviously a serious concern. I think also social capital, the extent to which people trust, depend on each other, the engagement in society, but also the trust in institutions is also a concern that's fallen over the past decade. So I would say that they're sort of national challenges, but every state has an opportunity to build on its strengths. And I think that's key, is that states don't just look at their weaknesses, but continue to build on their strengths. And then the challenges will depend from state to state. But I think the great thing about the index is it helps highlight where others are doing well, where there's a weakness. And so you have the opportunity to learn and benefit from what someone else is doing rather than start from a blank sheet of paper.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Shaun. Any final comments from our panelists before we wrap up this event? No, you've done very well. Well, thank you so much. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions, comments in the chat. Thank you to our speakers, panelists for their thoughts. And I hope today's discussion will encourage wider and continued engagement across the US, and especially here in Colorado. As a reminder, as Shaun mentioned earlier, you can find more information, including all the raw data sets, at our website, www.usprosperity.net. And today's event, as I mentioned earlier, has been recorded and will be available in a few weeks' time. I think someone was asking if they could share that. We'd be very happy for you to share that recording. So we will be in touch with details of how to access this as soon as it's available. This event is also just one in a series of webinars we've been hosting. As Shaun spoke about, we've been doing county level analysis for quite a few different counties around the US. And we've got the last of our series actually being held this Wednesday with a focus on the national picture and specifically health. Details of this event will be posted in our chat function, and we would be delighted if you could join us for this. The Legatum Institute creates indexes, publishes reports, and hosts events to help leaders, policymakers, and influencers at every level identify the practical solutions that will deliver real and lasting prosperity, which is something that I think we've heard from our panelists is incredibly important to all of us. Please make full use of our index and its related resources to help set agendas for growth and development, and create roadmaps to improve institutional, economic, and social well-being for the whole of Colorado and for all Americans. Thank you so much for joining us today, and a special thank you to our expert panelists for generously giving of their time and also their very insightful perspectives. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you very much.